What if the ancients weren't discovering the cosmos for the first time, but remembering it? What if those clay tablets, pressed with reed styluses in the flickering light of temple workshops, weren't records of new observations, but copies of knowledge already ancient when Sumer itself was young? In the ruins of Mesopotamia, beneath layers of sand and fallen ziggurats, archaeologists found star charts that shouldn't exist, lists of celestial bodies too complete, calculations too precise, descriptions of planets invisible to the naked eye, worlds that modern science wouldn't confirm for thousands of years, catalogued as casually as if the priests of Ur were listing sheep in a temple inventory. The night sky they watched so carefully held more than stars and gods. It held a mystery that still defies complete explanation. So before the story pulls you under, take a moment to like this video and hit subscribe, but only if you're drawn to those moments when ancient knowledge brushes against impossible precision. And if you're still here, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I want to imagine this celestial mystery stretching across the world, connecting us all beneath the same stars the Sumerians mapped with such inexplicable accuracy. Tonight, we're going to explore what happens when archaeology uncovers something that challenges the timeline of discovery itself, when tablets older than philosophy describe worlds that weren't supposed to be known for millennia. Let yourself settle in. The ancient sky is waiting, and it has questions we're only beginning to ask. The British archaeologist Leonard Woolley wasn't looking for astronomy when he broke ground at Ur in 1922. He was searching for the biblical past, for evidence of Abraham and the cities mentioned in Genesis. But beneath the foundations of temples dedicated to the moon god Nana, his team uncovered something unexpected: clay tablets covered in cuneiform script, listing celestial bodies with methodical precision. Among the inventories of grain and tribute, the administrative records of long-dead kings were documents that mapped the heavens with an attention to detail that seemed to belong to a far more advanced civilization. The tablets were fragmentary, damaged by millennia of pressure and moisture, but what remained was enough to make Woolley pause and wonder what else might be buried in the Mesopotamian dust. The excavation at Ur was brutal work. Imagine the heat of southern Iraq in summer. Temperatures climbing past 45 degrees Celsius, the air so dry it pulled moisture from your lungs with each breath. Woolley's team worked in trenches that cut through millennia of habitation, through layers of ash and broken pottery, through floors where Bronze Age children had played and priests had walked barefoot on their way to morning rituals. They found jewellery of impossible delicacy, golden headdresses and lapis lazuli amulets that spoke of wealth and artistic sophistication. They found the royal tombs, where kings and queens had been buried with their entire courts, evidence of ritual sacrifice on a scale that shocked even archaeologists accustomed to ancient brutality. But it was the tablets, always the tablets, that carried the real weight. Cuneiform script looks like bird tracks pressed into mud. Each character is a combination of wedge-shaped impressions made by a reed stylus, a system so efficient it lasted for over 3,000 years across multiple languages and empires. But reading cuneiform isn't like reading an alphabet. Each sign can represent a sound, a word, or an idea depending on context. Deciphering astronomical tablets required not just linguistic skill, but mathematical knowledge, an understanding of ancient measurement systems, familiarity with Sumerian and Akkadian astronomical terminology. The tablets Woolley found at Ur were catalogued, packed carefully in cotton wool, shipped to the British Museum where they joined thousands of other fragments, waiting for scholars who could unlock their meaning. It would be years before the astronomical significance of some tablets became clear. The initial focus was on administrative texts, the inventories and accounts that helped archaeologists understand the economic structure of ancient Mesopotamia. But gradually, as Assyriologists worked through the collections, certain tablets revealed themselves as something different: star lists, planetary observations, mathematical tables for calculating celestial positions. These weren't religious texts, though they came from temples. They weren't myths or poetry. They were technical documents, working papers of ancient astronomers who track the heavens with the systematic precision of scientists. What struck researchers wasn't just that ancient people watched the sky carefully. Every agricultural civilization needed to track seasons, to know when to plant and harvest, to predict flooding and drought. The moon's phases were universal timekeepers. The sun's position marked the year's rhythm. This was expected, practical astronomy born of necessity. But the Mesopotamian tablets showed something beyond practical need. They showed curiosity, systematic observation for its own sake, the tracking of planetary movements that had no immediate agricultural or religious purpose, as if the astronomers were compiling knowledge simply because the cosmos demanded understanding. The precision was what unsettled, not rough approximations but careful measurements, observations repeated over years and decades, patterns recognized and recorded with methodical attention that suggested this wasn't casual skywatching, but something approaching modern scientific methodology. And among these tablets, buried in lists and calculations, were references that didn't quite make sense, numbers that seemed too complete, descriptions of celestial bodies that accounted for more than the obvious visible planets. Nothing explicit enough to prove anything, but enough to make scholars pause and wonder whether the gaps in our understanding were gaps in the ancient record, or gaps in our willingness to consider what they might actually have observed. In museum collections across Europe and America, 2 tablets stand apart from all others in the study of ancient astronomy, known as MUL.APIN, named after the opening words, quote, 0. These tablets represent the most comprehensive astronomical compendium from the ancient world. Compiled around 700 BCE, but based on observations dating back to at least 1500 BCE, they list stars, constellations, and planetary movements with systematic precision. But it's not the age of these tablets that unsettles researchers, it's what they describe. Among the familiar planets visible to the naked eye, Venus and Jupiter and Mars tracking their predictable paths across the dome of night, there are references that don't quite fit, descriptions that seem to account for more than the 5 wandering stars ancient people were supposed to know. The MUL.APIN tablets are not beautiful objects. They're clay, baked hard by fire, covered in dense columns of wedge-shaped marks that march across their surfaces with relentless regularity. No illustrations, no diagrams, just text. Pure information pressed into mud before writing became an art form. The tablets are broken, of course. 4,000 years in the earth doesn't leave clay intact. But enough survives, and enough copies exist from different periods and locations, that scholars have reconstructed most of the content with confidence. The compendium begins with a comprehensive star catalogue, listing constellations by their heliacal risings, the moment each year when they first become visible on the eastern horizon, just before sunrise. This is sophisticated observational astronomy. To create such a catalogue requires watching the sky systematically for an entire year, noting the exact day each constellation appears, understanding the gradual shift of stellar positions through the seasons. The MUL.APIN lists 66 stars and star clusters, organising them into 3 celestial paths associated with the gods Enlil, Anu and Ea, roughly corresponding to northern, equatorial and southern regions of the sky, visible from Mesopotamia. But the tablets go beyond star catalogues. They include sections on planetary movements, describing the paths of Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn through the zodiac. They provide mathematical schemes for calculating the length of day and night throughout the year. They list lunar eclipses and their omens. They describe the relationship between celestial events and earthly phenomena, when to expect storms based on planetary positions, when crops might fail or flourish depending on conjunctions of planets and stars. This is omen astronomy. Yes, the fusion of observation and divination that characterized Mesopotamian science. But underneath the religious framework, the observational data is precise and reproducible. Modern astronomers have used the stellar positions recorded in mul.apin to date the observations themselves. Because Earth's axis wobbles slowly over thousands of years, a phenomenon called precession, the position of stars relative to the horizon at any given time of year, changes gradually. By calculating backward, determining where the stars listed in mul.apin would have been positioned to match the descriptions in the text, researchers have confirmed that the observations date to approximately 1500 BCE, give or take a century. This is archaeological astronomy at its most elegant, using the slow movements of the cosmos itself as a dating tool, independent of pottery styles or carbon isotopes. But embedded within the mul.apin's comprehensive catalogues are anomalies, references to planetary bodies that seem to go beyond the classical five. Not explicit declarations, nothing that says here is a sixth planet beyond Saturn, but subtle inconsistencies in numbering, groupings that don't quite align with the five visible wanderers, technical terms whose precise meaning scholars still debate. Some researchers dismiss these as scribal errors. Copies of copies introducing mistakes over generations of transmission. Others suggest they're symbolic or mythological references that we're misinterpreting as astronomical data. But a small number of scholars, often working quietly to avoid ridicule from mainstream academia, wonder whether these anomalies might represent actual observations of bodies that modern astronomy insists the ancients couldn't have seen. The precision of everything else in mul.apin makes these anomalies more intriguing, not less. This isn't a text prone to careless error. It's systematic, methodical, the work of multiple generations of astronomers refining and confirming their observations. When such a text contains references that don't fit expected patterns, it demands explanation. And sometimes the simplest explanation is the one we're most reluctant to accept, that they recorded what they saw, even if what they saw challenges our assumptions about the limits of ancient observation. Stand beneath a clear sky far from city lights, and you can see what the ancients saw. Mercury, difficult but visible near the horizon at dawn or dusk. Venus, brilliant as a lamp, outshining everything except the sun and moon. Mars, rust-red and steady, moving slowly through the zodiac. Jupiter, bright and calm, the king of wanderers. Saturn, dimmer but unmistakable, the outermost planet visible without optical aid. These five were known to every ancient civilization that watched the sky with intention. The Babylonians tracked them, the Greeks named them for gods, the Chinese recorded their movements in silk-bound books. 5 planets. Always 5. Until modern telescopes reveal the truth that more worlds circled beyond Saturn's orbit, invisible to human eyes for all of history, or so we thought. The experience of seeing planets with naked eyes is something modern people have largely forgotten. Light pollution drowns out all but the brightest celestial objects. Most people have never seen the Milky Way splashed across a truly dark sky, never watched Jupiter's steady light outshine everything but Venus, never tracked Mars through its retrograde motion as Earth overtakes it in its orbital path. But in the ancient world, before electric lights transformed night into a dimmer version of day, the sky was an overwhelming presence. Not a handful of stars, but thousands, dense rivers of light marking the spiral arm of our galaxy, planets moving against this stellar backdrop with a steadiness that marked them as fundamentally different from stars. Mercury is the trickiest of the 5. It never strays far from the sun, visible only near the horizon in the brief window of twilight. Ancient astronomers needed to know exactly where and when to look, understanding Mercury's synodic period well enough to predict its appearances. The planet shows phases like the moon when viewed through a telescope, but to the naked eye it appears as a bright star-like point hugging the horizon, present for a few weeks and then gone, lost in the sun's glare until its next appearance on the opposite side of the solar disk. Venus needs no special knowledge to find. At its brightest, Venus casts shadows, bright enough to see by on moonless nights. The Babylonians knew it as two objects initially, the morning star and the evening star, before recognizing they were the same body appearing in different parts of its orbit. They tracked Venus with obsessive precision, noting every appearance and disappearance, building mathematical models to predict its 8-year cycle as it traces a nearly perfect pentagon in the sky, returning to the same position relative to Earth and the Sun every 8 years to within a day or two. Mars, Jupiter and Saturn move more slowly, taking years to complete their journeys through the zodiac. Mars's 2-year cycle, brightening to a fierce red point when Earth passes it on the inner track, dimming as the planets separate. Jupiter's 12-year journey, steady and bright, the planet ancient peoples associated with kingship and justice. Saturn, pale yellow and dimmer, taking 29 years to circle the Sun, the outermost boundary of the visible solar system. To ancient observers without telescopes, Saturn was the edge of the world, the final wanderer beyond which lay only the fixed stars and the vast unknowable depths of space. These 5 planets were enough. They provided complexity sufficient for sophisticated astronomical systems, for divination and calendar keeping, for religious cosmologies and philosophical speculation about the nature of the heavens. No ancient civilization needed more than 5 planets to build complete and functional astronomical traditions, which makes it all the more intriguing when texts occasionally reference more. Not common references, not unambiguous declarations, but hints and fragments that suggest the ancients might have been watching for something beyond Saturn's orbit, tracking movements too subtle for casual observation, but perhaps not impossible for astronomers with centuries of accumulated records and refined observational techniques to detect. But Sumerian astronomical texts sometimes speak of 7 planets. Not 5, 7 wandering stars among the fixed constellations. Modern scholars initially dismissed this as including the Sun and Moon in the count, a common practice in ancient cosmology, where anything that moved against the background of stars was considered a wanderer. And yet, the linguistic analysis doesn't always support this interpretation. Some tablets seem to distinguish clearly between the luminaries, Sun and Moon, and the planetary bodies. They use different terms, different categories, as if the scribes understood a fundamental difference, which raises the question that archaeoastronomers still debate in academic journals. What were those 2 additional bodies the Sumerians were tracking? What moved through their sky that we've forgotten how to see? The number 7 holds special significance in Mesopotamian culture. 7 gates to the underworld, 7 divine judges, 7 sages who brought civilization's gifts to humanity. Some scholars argue this is merely numerological preference, a sacred number imposed on astronomy rather than derived from observation. But Mesopotamian astronomy was remarkably resistant to letting religious symbolism override observational accuracy. When they counted stars in a constellation, they counted actual stars, not symbolic numbers. When they measured the length of the solar year, they measured it precisely, not in symbolic units. The practical and the sacred coexisted, certainly, but practitioners understood the difference. The linguistic evidence is subtle but persistent. Akkadian astronomical texts sometimes use the term bibu, which translates roughly as planet or wandering star. When texts enumerate bibu, the count occasionally exceeds 5, even in passages where the Sun and Moon are clearly referenced separately using their standard terms, shamash and sin. This doesn't happen often, it's not a consistent pattern across all texts, but it occurs frequently enough that dismissing it as simple scribal error becomes difficult. Errors tend to be random. These references to additional planets appear in contexts that suggest intentionality, embedded in systematic lists and calculations rather than casual mentions. One possible explanation involves the phenomenon of bright comets. A sufficiently bright comet, visible for weeks or months moving against the background stars, might be recorded as an additional wandering body, but comets were recognized as a separate category in Mesopotamian astronomy. They had their own omens, their own terminology, They were hairy stars or demon stars, explicitly distinguished from the regular planets whose movements followed predictable patterns. The additional bodies referenced in some planetary lists don't carry the linguistic markers of comets or other transient phenomena. Another explanation involves asteroids, particularly Vesta, which can occasionally be bright enough to see with excellent eyesight under perfect viewing conditions. But Vesta's movement is slow and its brightness variable. Detecting it would require systematic observation over many months, distinguishing its motion from background stars. Possible for dedicated astronomers with good records, perhaps, but it wouldn't explain consistent references to 7 planets rather than 6, or 8, or some other number accounting for multiple visible asteroids, which leaves the possibility that continues to provoke quiet speculation in corners of the academic world, where researchers can discuss anomalies without risking their reputations. The possibility that Mesopotamian astronomers, through some combination of excellent atmospheric conditions, generational observation, accumulated records, and refined techniques we don't fully understand, detected the faint motion of bodies beyond Saturn. Not clearly, not consistently enough to build detailed models of their orbits, but enough to know that something moved out there in the darkness beyond the known wanderers. Enough to count them and record their existence, even if the full understanding of what they were seeing wouldn't come for another 4,000 years. William Herschel discovered Uranus on the 13th of March, 1781, through a handmade telescope in his garden in Bath, England. It was the first planet found in recorded history, the first expansion of the solar system beyond the ancient 5. Uranus, pale green and distant, invisible to the naked eye. Unknown to classical astronomy. Neptune followed, discovered by mathematical prediction in 1846, when astronomers noticed Uranus's orbit wobbling under an unseen gravitational influence. These were triumphs of modern science, proof that the cosmos held more than the ancients could have known. And yet, in the quiet archives where Sumerian tablets rest behind climate-controlled glass, there are references that make researchers pause, descriptions that seem too specific, numbers that seem too complete, as if somewhere in the long memory of Mesopotamian astronomy, there was knowledge that shouldn't have existed for another 4,000 years. Herschel wasn't searching for a new planet. He was conducting a systematic survey of the night sky, cataloguing stars, looking for nebulae and other interesting objects. On that March night, he noticed what he initially described as a comet, a disk-like object rather than a point of light like a star. But as he tracked it over subsequent nights and weeks, he realized its movement was too slow, its orbit too regular. This wasn't a comet streaking through the inner solar system. This was something else entirely. Other astronomers confirmed his observations, calculated the orbit, and reached the stunning conclusion: Herschel had found a planet, the first new planet discovered since humans began watching the sky. Uranus is just barely beyond the threshold of naked eye visibility. At magnitude 5.9 at its brightest, under absolutely perfect conditions, dark skies far from any light pollution. With excellent eyesight and the knowledge of exactly where to look, it's theoretically possible to see Uranus without optical aid. It would appear as the faintest star imaginable, a dim point that might be mistaken for a background star except for one crucial detail: it moves. Over weeks and months it shifts position against the fixed stars, describing its slow 84-year orbit around the Sun. But detecting this movement without a telescope requires comparing observations separated by long periods, requires knowing where to look, requires the kind of systematic record-keeping that can distinguish a very dim planet from the thousands of similarly dim stars that populate the night sky. Ancient astronomers never mentioned Uranus by name, never described its orbital period, never assigned it a god, or calculated its movements with the precision they applied to Saturn or Jupiter. There's no question that they didn't know Uranus as a planet in the way they knew the classical five, but could they have detected it as an anomaly? A star that didn't behave like other stars, that moved when it should have been fixed. Some researchers have argued that a few ancient observations of stars that change position might actually be inadvertent recordings of Uranus during periods when it was relatively bright. But the evidence is circumstantial at best, more interesting speculation than proof. Neptune is even more problematic. At magnitude 8, it's well beyond naked eye visibility under any circumstances. Its discovery came through mathematical analysis. Astronomers calculating where an unseen planet must be based on perturbations in Uranus's orbit, and then pointing telescopes at that position until they found it. This was theoretical astronomy at its most sophisticated, prediction before observation, mathematics revealing what the eye could never see. For ancient astronomers to have known about Neptune would require not just exceptional observational capability, but theoretical understanding of orbital mechanics that wouldn't be developed until Newton described gravity in the 17th century. And yet, the anomalies in the texts remain. Not proof of anything, not clear evidence that demands acceptance. But enough to keep the question alive in the minds of researchers willing to sit with uncertainty, willing to acknowledge that the absence of definitive evidence isn't the same as evidence of absence. The tablets record 7 wandering bodies in some contexts. Modern astronomy knows of more than 7 planets in our solar system, when you count all the bodies from Mercury out past Neptune and into the Kuiper belt. The gap between ancient knowledge and modern discovery might not be as absolute as we've assumed. Or it might be exactly as we think. The 7 planets a product of including sun and moon, the anomalies nothing more than errors and symbolic references we're overinterpreting in our desire to find mystery where there's only human nature's constant tendency to watch the sky and wonder what moves in the darkness beyond our sight. Among the most extensive collections of Babylonian astronomical texts is the Enuma Anu Enlil, a compendium of omens and celestial observations spanning 70 tablets, created over centuries, compiled from observations dating back to the Old Babylonian period around 1800 BCE. These tablets represent humanity's first systematic attempt to correlate heavenly movements with earthly events. But buried within the omens, the predictions of war and flood and harvest, are technical descriptions of planetary positions that reveal an observational sophistication that shouldn't have been possible without instruments. The tablets describe synodic periods, the time it takes for a planet to return to the same position relative to the Sun and Earth, with accuracy that suggests either centuries of continuous observation or access to knowledge already refined before the tablets were inscribed. And in some fragments, there are planetary references that don't align with the 5 visible worlds, as if the observers were tracking something more, something beyond the edge of naked eye visibility. The Enuma Anu Enlil wasn't created by a single author or even a single generation. It's a living document, if clay can be called living, accumulated over centuries by astronomers who understood their work as part of an unbroken tradition, stretching back into a past already ancient to them. The earliest tablets date to the Old Babylonian period, but the observations they record may be older still, copied from sources now lost, preserving knowledge from Sumerian predecessors who first systematized the watching of the heavens. By the time the series reached its final form in the first millennium BCE, it had become the foundational text of Mesopotamian astronomy, the reference work that every aspiring astronomer priest would study and memorize. The structure is methodical almost to the point of monotony. Tablet after tablet of conditional statements. If the moon appears at a certain position relative to specific stars, then the king will face rebellion. If Venus disappears from the evening sky on a particular day, then floods will devastate the harvest. If Jupiter and Mars appear in conjunction in a certain constellation, then peace will prevail. This is divination, the practice of reading divine will in natural phenomena. Modern skeptics dismiss it as superstition, pattern-seeking in randomness. But underneath the ominous predictions lies rigorous observation. To make these connections, real or imagined, between heaven and earth required knowing exactly where planets were, when they appeared and disappeared, how they moved through the zodiac. The omens were built on a foundation of precise astronomical data. What makes the Enuma Anu Enlil particularly valuable for modern researchers is its technical precision. The tablets don't just say quote 7, they specify the exact constellation, the relationship to other celestial bodies, sometimes even the number of days since the last appearance. They describe planetary phenomena in language that allows modern astronomers to calculate backward, to determine which actual astronomical events the ancient observers were recording, and the accuracy is remarkable. Synodic periods. Those complex calculations of when planets return to the same position relative to Earth and the Sun are given in the tablets with precision that would require decades of systematic observation to derive independently. But here and there, embedded in the systematic cataloguing of the 5 known planets, are references that don't quite fit the pattern. Omens that mention planetary conjunctions involving more bodies than should be visible. Technical terms whose precise meaning remains debated among scholars, words that might refer to aspects of known planets, or might indicate additional bodies tracked by the observers. Nothing explicit, nothing that definitively proves knowledge of outer planets. But enough anomalies that researchers who spend years reading these tablets, who develop an intuitive feel for the scribe's style and methodology, sometimes pause and wonder whether they're missing something in translation, whether concepts that made perfect sense to ancient astronomers have become opaque to us, separated by 4 millennia and the death of the cuneiform tradition. The Enuma Anu Enlil also reveals the institutional nature of Babylonian astronomy. This wasn't casual observation by individuals. It was a state-supported enterprise with professional astronomers employed by temples, their observations preserved in archives, their methods taught to apprentices who would continue the work after the masters died. Such institutions could maintain observational programs spanning centuries, accumulating data that no individual could gather in a single lifetime. And if an institution watches the sky systematically for 500 years, for 1,000 years, what might they detect that shorter observations would miss? What slow movements, what subtle patterns, what faint wanderers beyond Saturn's orbit might reveal themselves to those patient enough to compile and analyze centuries of accumulated data? The tablets rest in museums now, scattered across collections in London, Berlin, Philadelphia, Istanbul. Many are fragmentary, broken pieces of larger works. Scholars estimate we have perhaps 40% of the complete Enuma Anu Enlil series. The rest is lost, destroyed when libraries burned or crumbled, still buried beneath Iraqi archaeological sites that remain unexcavated. What astronomical knowledge might be recorded in those missing tablets? What observations, what calculations, what references to celestial phenomena we can't yet properly interpret because we don't have the complete context? The question haunts researchers who know that most of ancient knowledge is gone forever, that we're working with fragments and trying to reconstruct complete cosmologies from incomplete evidence. In the British Museum, Tablet K160 holds one of the most precise astronomical records from the ancient world. Known as the Venus Tablet of Amisaduqa, it records the rising and setting of Venus over a 21-year period during the reign of the Babylonian king Amisaduqa, around 1600 BCE. The accuracy is startling. Modern astronomers can use this tablet to calculate the exact years of Amisaduqa's reign, working backward through planetary cycles to pinpoint dates millennia in the past. But this precision raises a question. How did Bronze Age astronomers achieve such accuracy? The level of systematic observation required would have needed not just one lifetime of watching, but generations. An unbroken chain of record-keeping, of priests and scribes inheriting not just the tablets, but the methodology, the patience, the understanding that celestial knowledge was something worth preserving across centuries. Unless, of course, they were working from knowledge already ancient, already perfected, when they first pressed reeds into wet clay. Venus is predictable, but not simple. It appears in the evening sky after sunset for several months, growing brighter until it dominates the twilight, then disappearing as it passes between Earth and the Sun. After a period of invisibility, it reappears in the morning sky before dawn, rising ahead of the Sun, again growing brighter before gradually fading as it moves behind the Sun in its orbit. The complete cycle takes approximately 584 days. But Venus's orbit isn't perfectly circular, and Earth's orbit isn't perfectly circular, so the exact length of time between appearances varies slightly. Tracking these variations requires consistent observation over many cycles. The Venus tablet records these appearances and disappearances with meticulous detail. Not just Venus appeared in the east, but Venus appeared in the east in the constellation of the Lion on the 25th day of the month of Abu, and remained visible for 3 months and 15 days before disappearing. This level of detail transforms the tablet from a religious document into a scientific record. Modern researchers can input these observations into astronomical software, calculate where Venus actually was on various dates in the 2nd millennium BCE, and work out which years match the tablet's descriptions. This is how archaeologists have narrowed down the possible dates for Amisaduka's reign, using astronomy as an independent dating method that confirms or challenges other chronological evidence. But the precision poses a puzzle. To achieve this level of accuracy requires not just watching Venus during Amisaduka's reign, but understanding its cycles well enough to recognize when observations match expected patterns and when they deviate. This understanding could only come from prior observations, previous cycles recorded and analysed, which means the Venus tablet represents the culmination of a long tradition, not its beginning. Somewhere in the centuries before Amisaduka, Babylonian astronomers began the systematic tracking of Venus. They watched, they recorded, they recognised patterns, and their successors inherited these records, continued the observations, refined the understanding until they could create documents like the Venus tablet that compressed decades of data into a form useful for both divination and practical astronomy. This generational transmission of knowledge is what allowed ancient astronomy to achieve sophistication that seems impossible for its era. No single astronomer could track Saturn's 29-year orbit and confirm the pattern with multiple observations. But an institution that maintained records for centuries could. An apprentice priest could inherit observations made by his grandfather's teacher, combine them with his own observations, and pass the accumulated knowledge to his own students. Over time, this process would build a comprehensive understanding of planetary movements that no individual could achieve alone. And if they were doing this for Venus, they were certainly doing it for the other visible planets. Tracking Mars through its 2-year cycle, Jupiter through its 12-year journey, Saturn through its slow 3-decade orbit, building mathematical models, recognizing periodicities, developing techniques to predict future positions based on past observations. The sophistication we see in the Venus tablet represents a methodology that could be applied to any celestial body they chose to watch. Which raises the question, did they apply these techniques only to the bright, obvious planets? Or did they turn their refined observational methods toward fainter objects, toward the edge of visibility, searching for additional wanderers that might be moving too slowly or too dimly for casual observation to detect? The tablet itself offers no answer. It's focused entirely on Venus, the brightest and most dramatic of the planets. But the methodology it represents, the institutional dedication to multi-generational observation, it proves existed, opens possibilities that make researchers wonder what else the Babylonians might have tracked with the same systematic precision. Sumerian mythology describes reality as layered, structured in sevens, 7 heavens ascending above the earth, 7 underworlds descending below. This 7-fold division appears repeatedly in their religious texts, their temple architecture, their understanding of divine hierarchy. Some researchers argue that the 7 planets in certain astronomical lists are simply an extension of this numerological preference, a sacred number imposed on the cosmos rather than a literal count of observed bodies. But Sumerian astronomy was remarkably practical alongside its religious elements. They didn't let cosmological preferences override observational accuracy. They tracked lunar eclipses with precision that didn't care about sacred numbers. They measured the positions of stars without forcing them into symbolic patterns. So when they listed 7 planetary bodies, was it religion dictating astronomy, or astronomy informing religion? Were they shaping the cosmos to fit their beliefs? Or had they observed something that made 7 the natural, accurate number? The sacred 7 appears everywhere in Mesopotamian thought. 7 sages who brought the arts of civilization to humanity in the primordial past. 7 divine judges who determined fates in the underworld. 7 gates through which the goddess Inanna must pass on her descent to the realm of death, removing 1 garment at each gate. The number carries weight, significance, a sense of completeness and cosmic order. It's not arbitrary. In a culture that saw the universe as fundamentally ordered and meaningful, 7 represented perfection, wholeness, the full set of whatever was being counted. So when astronomical texts sometimes enumerate 7 planets, the default interpretation is obvious. They're including the sun and moon along with the 5 visible planets to reach the sacred number. This fits perfectly with ancient cosmology, where the sun and moon were considered wanderers like the planets, moving against the background of fixed stars. The concept of planet, a specifically non-luminous body orbiting the sun, is a modern distinction. Ancient astronomers grouped all moving celestial bodies together as fundamentally similar, objects that travelled through the zodiac while stars remained fixed in their patterns. And yet, the linguistic evidence doesn't always support this simple explanation. In many texts, the sun and moon are clearly referenced using their standard names and epithets: Shamash the sun god, Sin the moon god, with specific terminology that marks them as the great luminaries distinct from other celestial bodies. When these same texts then enumerate planets using different terminology, using words that specifically mean wandering stars or moving bodies, and when these enumerations sometimes reach 7, it becomes harder to argue that they're simply including the sun and moon in the count. The scribes were too careful with language, too precise in their terminology, to accidentally conflate categories they understood as distinct. Another consideration is the practical accuracy of Sumerian astronomy. These were people who could predict lunar eclipses, who tracked the positions of stars with enough precision that modern astronomers can use their records for dating. They weren't prone to letting religious symbolism override observational reality. When they counted stars in a constellation, they counted actual stars, even if the number wasn't sacred. The Pleiades are always described as 7 stars, even though most people can see 6 with naked eyes, which suggests they either had better eyesight, better atmospheric conditions, or were including a dimmer star that's right at the edge of visibility. The point is they counted what they saw, not what symbolism demanded. So when astronomical texts list 7 planets, there's at least a possibility that it's not numerological preference but observational accuracy, that they actually tracked 7 wandering bodies through the fixed stars, distinguished clearly from the sun and moon which followed their own unique paths. This doesn't prove they knew about Uranus and Neptune. It doesn't even prove they were tracking anything beyond the classical 5. But it leaves the question open, creates space for the possibility that their 7-fold cosmology was built on something observed rather than something imposed. The alternative interpretations are mundane and probably correct. 7 planets means 5 visible planets plus sun and moon, despite the linguistic anomalies that seem to distinguish them. Or 7 represents symbolic completeness rather than literal count. Or the references are to different aspects of the same planets, to mythological elaborations that have no astronomical basis. These explanations are simpler, require fewer assumptions, fit more comfortably with mainstream understanding of ancient capabilities, but they don't quite eliminate the small persistent questions that researchers encounter when they dive deep into the texts and find patterns that don't quite match expectations. The Sumerians didn't separate astronomy from theology. Each planet was a god, each god's movements through the sky, a manifestation of divine will. Inanna was Venus, Nergal was Mars, Marduk was Jupiter, Ninurta was Saturn. But in the god lists, those extensive catalogues of deities organised by hierarchy and function, there are sometimes more planetary gods than there are visible planets. Minor deities associated with celestial movements, described as wanderers through the fixed stars, whose names and functions don't quite match the classical five. Scholars have interpreted these as aspects of major gods, fragmentary references to stars rather than planets, or simply mythological elaboration with no astronomical basis. But what if the ancient priests were more literal than we've assumed? What if those additional celestial gods represented actual observed bodies, worlds they watched and tracked, but we've lost the ability to see without technological aid? The god lists are some of the most extensive documents preserved from ancient Mesopotamia, tablets and tablets of divine names, organised by family relationships, by areas of authority, by cultic associations. Major gods with hundreds of epithets and minor deities barely mentioned anywhere else in the literature. These lists served practical functions for priests who needed to know the complete pantheon, who had to perform rituals addressing the right deities in the right order. But they also served as theological documents, mapping the divine hierarchy, showing how various aspects of reality were governed by different supernatural beings. Among these countless deities are gods specifically associated with celestial movements. The major planetary gods are well known and clearly identified. Inanna, called Ishtar in Akkadian, goddess of love and war, is Venus without question. Her mythology even preserves the dual nature of Venus as both morning and evening star. Nergal, god of the underworld and warfare, is Mars, appropriate given the planet's blood-red colour. Marduk, the great god of Babylon who rose to supremacy in the pantheon, is Jupiter, king of planets just as Marduk became king of gods. Ninurta, warrior and agricultural deity, is Saturn. The identification of Mercury is less certain, sometimes associated with Nabu, the god of writing and wisdom. But beyond these clear identifications are references to other divine beings described in terms that sound astronomical. Minor gods whose movements are tracked, whose appearances and disappearances are noted, who wander through the realm of fixed stars in ways that sound like planetary descriptions, but don't quite match any of the known five. Scholars have various explanations. Some suggest these are alternative names for the same planets, different aspects or phases of Venus, Mars, or the others. Some argue they're references to specific bright stars that ancient observers conflated with planets. Some propose they're purely mythological figures with no astronomical referent at all, literary creations rather than observed phenomena. But there's an assumption underlying all these explanations, that the ancient priests were either confused or symbolic in their descriptions, that they couldn't possibly have been literally recording observations of additional celestial bodies because such bodies aren't visible without modern instruments. This assumption is probably justified. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and vague references to minor gods aren't extraordinary evidence. But the assumption itself deserves examination. What if the priests meant exactly what they wrote? What if those minor planetary deities represented actual observations, however imperfect or uncertain, of bodies beyond the classical five? Consider the nature of ancient astronomical practice. These weren't casual skywatchers. They were professional observers, trained from youth in the systematic recording of celestial phenomena, working with records accumulated over centuries, operating with techniques refined through generations of practice. They knew the difference between planets and stars. They understood planetary motion. If they recorded additional wandering deities beyond the obvious five, Might they have been attempting to preserve observations of genuine phenomena that were right at the edge of what their methods could detect? The question has no clear answer. The god lists are fragmentary, their language sometimes ambiguous, their astronomical references mixed with purely mythological material. Separating observation from imagination in ancient religious texts is always challenging, but the texts exist, and they contain anomalies that don't fit neat explanations. Minor planetary gods without clear identification, descriptions of celestial movements that seem to account for more than 5 bodies, theological structures that suggest a cosmology slightly more complex than the simple 5-planet model we assume ancient peoples worked with. No discussion of Sumerian astronomy and hidden planets can avoid Zecharia Sitchin. In his series of books beginning with the 12th planet in 1976, Sitchin claimed that Sumerian texts described a solar system of 12 bodies including the Sun and Moon, and that one of these was a massive planet called Nibiru with an extremely elliptical orbit that brought it through the inner solar system every 3,600 years. His translations of cuneiform tablets, he argued, revealed that the Sumerians had comprehensive knowledge of the entire solar system, including the outer planets, given to them by extraterrestrial visitors. The academic community has thoroughly rejected Sitchin's translations and interpretations. Professional Assyriologists point to mistranslations, selective reading of texts, and fundamental misunderstandings of Sumerian grammar and cosmology. And yet, Sitchin's work raises a question that remains valid even as his conclusions are dismissed. Why do some Sumerian astronomical texts seem to reference more celestial bodies than they should have been able to observe? Sitchin was not a trained Assyriologist. He studied economics at the University of London, worked as a journalist and author, taught himself to read cuneiform through independent study. His interpretations of ancient texts rely on translations that professional scholars consider fundamentally flawed. He would take a Sumerian word with multiple possible meanings, choose the interpretation that supported his thesis, and build elaborate theories on these selective readings. His understanding of Sumerian grammar, of the context in which texts were written, of the scholarly work that had already thoroughly analysed these documents, was inadequate to the ambitious claims he was making. The specific text Sitchin focused on most heavily is known as Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic. He interpreted this myth as a literal description of solar system formation, with the planet Nibiru colliding with a primordial world called Tiamat, splitting it to form Earth and the asteroid belt. He read lists of gods as lists of planets, saw references to celestial battles as descriptions of orbital mechanics, and concluded that ancient peoples possessed detailed astronomical knowledge they could only have received from advanced extraterrestrial visitors who came from this supposed planet Nibiru. Professional Assyriologists have systematically dismantled Sitchin's translations. Dr. Michael Heiser, a scholar of ancient Semitic languages, wrote extensively on the errors in Sitchin's work, showing how words were mistranslated, how grammar was misunderstood, how context was ignored in service of predetermined conclusions. When Sitchin translates a word as planet, scholars show that the same word more accurately means god or divine being with no astronomical connotation. When he interprets a phrase as describing orbital mechanics, scholars demonstrate that it's standard mythological language common across ancient Near Eastern literature. The planet Nibiru itself has no astronomical support. No planet with a 3,600-year orbit exists in our solar system. Such an orbit would be gravitationally unstable, would have effects on other planets that we don't observe, would be detectable through modern surveys that have mapped objects throughout the solar system. The search for Planet 9, a hypothetical planet in the outer solar system that some astronomers propose based on orbital anomalies of trans-Neptunian objects, is serious science using careful analysis of gravitational effects. But Planet 9, if it exists, is nothing like Nibiru. It's not approaching the inner solar system, doesn't pass near Earth, has an orbital period measured in thousands of years, and a distance that keeps it perpetually in the outer reaches of the solar system. So why discuss Sitchin at all in a serious examination of ancient astronomy? Because despite his flawed methodology and rejected conclusions, he asked a question worth considering. Do Sumerian astronomical texts contain more than we think? The answer from mainstream scholarship is clear. No, they contain exactly what careful translation and analysis reveals, which is sophisticated astronomy within the capabilities of naked-eye observers, impressive mathematical models, but nothing that requires knowledge of outer planets or extraterrestrial contact. But Sitchin's massive popular success, his book selling millions of copies, speaks to a persistent human intuition that ancient peoples knew more than we give them credit for, that there are mysteries in these texts we haven't fully unraveled. That intuition isn't evidence. It's not a substitute for careful scholarship. But it's worth acknowledging that the anomalies exist, that professional scholars do encounter references and numbers that don't fit neat explanations, and that dismissing all such anomalies as errors or myths might be premature even as we firmly reject the ancient astronaut theories built on misreadings and wishful thinking. When you ask scholars who've devoted careers to reading cuneiform, who can parse the subtle differences between Sumerian and Akkadian astronomical terminology, they offer more measured interpretations. Dr. Lisbrack Berntson's work on Babylonian mathematical astronomy shows how the observation of 5 planets, combined with sophisticated mathematical models, could produce remarkably complete predictive systems. Dr. John Britton's analysis of astronomical tablets reveals that what seem like references to unknown planets are often technical terms for specific positions or phases of known bodies. The consensus among Assyriologists is clear. There is no credible evidence in Sumerian or Babylonian texts for knowledge of Uranus, Neptune, or any other trans-Saturnian planet. The astronomical sophistication of Mesopotamian cultures is impressive enough without adding unsupported claims. But even within this academic consensus, there are fragments that don't quite fit, anomalies that respected researchers acknowledge without being able to fully explain. Professional Assyriologists approach cuneiform tablets with a level of expertise that takes decades to develop. Learning to read cuneiform isn't like learning a foreign language with living speakers and abundant texts. It's archaeological linguistics, reconstructing dead languages from fragmentary sources, comparing texts from different periods and regions, slowly building understanding of grammar, vocabulary, and context. The best scholars can look at a damaged tablet and reconstruct missing sections based on parallel texts, recognizing formulaic phrases and standard terminology. They understand the nuances of how astronomical language evolved from Sumerian through Akkadian, how the same concepts were expressed differently in different periods. Dr. Lisbrack Berntsson, Professor Emerita at the University of Regensburg, has spent her career analysing Babylonian mathematical astronomy. Her work demonstrates that what might appear to modern readers as references to unknown planets are actually sophisticated mathematical constructs. The Babylonians developed what's called, quote, 16 mathematical formulas that model the variable speed of celestial bodies as they move through their orbits. These functions require no knowledge of elliptical orbits or Kepler's laws. They're purely empirical, derived from centuries of observation, using patterns recognized in the data to predict future positions. When tablets reference multiple aspects or positions of planets, they're not necessarily describing multiple planets, but rather different phases or positions of the same body within complex mathematical schemes. Dr. John Britton's work has been similarly illuminating. His analysis of astronomical procedure texts, the working documents that show how Babylonian astronomers calculated planetary positions, reveals the technical terminology that can be misinterpreted as references to unknown bodies. Terms that might translate as, quote, 17 or, quote, 18 aren't naming separate planets, but describing specific phenomena or calculation methods. The tablets used technical language that made perfect sense to ancient astronomers trained in the system, but can seem ambiguous or mysterious to modern readers without that context. The academic consensus is not dismissive or close-minded. Professional scholars are excited by genuine mysteries in the texts. When the Antikythera mechanism was analysed and revealed sophistication no one expected, researchers embraced the implications and revised their understanding of ancient technological capabilities. When new translations of mathematical astronomy texts revealed that Babylonians were using geometrical methods centuries before such techniques appeared in Greek astronomy, scholars published the findings prominently and reconsidered what ancient peoples were capable of achieving. The field is open to evidence that challenges assumptions, but the consensus on outer planets is firm because the evidence isn't there. Scholars who've read thousands of astronomical tablets, who understand the full context of Mesopotamian astronomy, who can distinguish technical terminology from mythological elaboration, consistently find no credible references to trans-Saturnian planets. The anomalies exist, the unusual numbers and unexplained references, but alternative explanations are always more parsimonious than claims of impossible knowledge. Yet even in their careful debunking of overreaching claims, professional Assyriologists acknowledge the mysteries that remain. Dr. Britton notes in his work that some observational data in the tablets is more accurate than should be possible, given known limitations. Dr. Brack-Bernson has written about astronomical parameters that suggest access to longer observation periods than we can account for in the historical record. These aren't admissions that ancient peoples knew about Uranus or Neptune. They're acknowledgements that sophisticated ancient astronomy still holds puzzles, that our understanding is incomplete, that the fragmentary nature of the evidence means we're always working with uncertainty. The scholarly approach is to sit with that uncertainty rather than filling gaps with speculation, to say, quote 19 rather than quote 20 or quote 21, the rigorous methodology that leads scholars to reject extraordinary claims is the same methodology that allows them to make genuine discoveries about ancient astronomical sophistication. And that sophistication, even without adding knowledge of outer planets, is remarkable enough to inspire wonder at what Bronze Age observers achieved with nothing but their eyes, their patience, and their commitment to understanding the movements of the heavens. The mul.apin tablets don't just list planets. They catalogue stars and constellations with such precision that modern astronomers can use them to date the observations. By calculating the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that shifts the position of stars over centuries, researchers have determined that the stellar observations in mul.apin date to around 1500 BCE, give or take a century. This is archaeological detective work at its finest, using astronomy to confirm history. But what's remarkable is not just the age of the observations, but their completeness. The tablets describe heliacal risings, the moment when stars first become visible on the eastern horizon before sunrise, with accuracy that requires systematic observation over many years. They track the paths of constellations through the seasons with the precision of a modern ephemeris. This level of observational astronomy suggests an institutional commitment to skywatching that spanned generations. And institutions with that kind of continuity and sophistication might have recorded more than we've yet deciphered from their fragmented tablets. Precession is the slow wobble of Earth's rotation axis, like a spinning top gradually circling as it spins. The axis completes one full wobble every 26,000 years, which means the position of stars relative to the horizon at any given time of year shifts at a rate of about 1 degree every 72 years. This is imperceptibly slow. You could watch the sky your entire life and never notice precession. But over centuries, the effect becomes measurable. A star that rose at the spring equinox in 2000 BCE will be in a different position by 1000 BCE. When modern astronomers analyse the stellar positions described in mul.apin, they can work backward through precession to determine when those descriptions would have been accurate. The tablets describe which stars rise heliacally on specific days of the year, which constellations are visible at midnight during different months, how long stars remain above the horizon. By calculating where stars would have been positioned to match these descriptions, researchers have pinpointed the observations to approximately 1500 BCE, with uncertainty of perhaps 50 to 100 years in either direction. This dating technique is independent of any historical or archaeological evidence. It's pure astronomy, using the predictable mechanics of Earth's movement to determine when observations were made. And the fact that it works, that the stellar positions in mul.apin correspond to real astronomical configurations from a specific era, proves these weren't mythological or symbolic descriptions. They were actual observations, carefully recorded, accurately preserved through centuries of copying and transmission. But the precision goes beyond simply getting the positions right. The tablets describe heliacal risings with remarkable detail, noting not just which stars appeared, but in what order throughout the year, how many days separated different risings, which constellations were circumpolar and never set below the horizon, which were only briefly visible before being lost in the sun's glare. This level of systematic observation requires dedicated watchers tracking the sky every morning before dawn for an entire year, noting the exact day each star first became visible, distinguishing between stars that are easy to spot and those that require perfect atmospheric conditions and careful attention. The institutional dedication this implies is staggering. Someone had to decide that systematically cataloguing stellar positions was worth the investment of time and resources. Priests or astronomers had to be assigned the task, supported by temple economies that freed them from agricultural labour so they could focus on skywatching. The observations had to be recorded on tablets that were preserved, stored in libraries, protected from damage. And the program had to continue long enough to compile a complete annual catalogue, then be refined through additional years of observation to verify accuracy and fill gaps. This isn't casual astronomy. It's not priests occasionally glancing at the sky between rituals. It's systematic science conducted with institutional support and generational continuity, and institutions capable of this level of dedication to stellar observation would naturally apply the same methods to planetary observation. The wandering stars, the planets moving through the fixed constellations, would be even more interesting targets for systematic study than the predictable annual cycles of fixed stars. The mul.apin represents what survived. What was copied enough times and preserved in enough locations that modern archaeologists could excavate relatively complete versions. But it was surely part of a larger astronomical tradition. One component of extensive libraries and teaching curricula. What else did those ancient astronomers observe and record? What other celestial phenomena received the same systematic attention as the stars catalogued in Mul-Apin? The tablets that survive are a fraction of what once existed. For every astronomical text archaeologists recover, dozens or hundreds were lost when libraries burned, when cities were destroyed, when the cuneiform tradition finally died and no one remained who could read the ancient scripts. The sophistication preserved in mul.apin suggests capabilities we can verify, because the stellar observations can be checked against known astronomical positions. But that same sophistication, those same institutional resources and observational techniques, could have been directed toward phenomena more difficult to verify from fragmentary texts, toward faint objects at the edge of visibility, towards slow movements that only centuries of accumulated records would reveal. The question isn't whether they had the capability for such observations. mul.apin proves they did. The question is what they chose to observe and what those observations might have revealed. Saturn takes approximately 29.5 years to orbit the Sun. To accurately map its complete circuit through the zodiac, you'd need to watch for at least one full orbit, preferably more to confirm the pattern. That's a lifetime of observation for a single planet. Now consider that the Babylonians had mathematical models for planetary movements that accounted for long-term variations, cycles within cycles, periodicities that span decades. How did Bronze Age astronomers accomplish this? The answer has to be generational knowledge, unbroken chains of observation and record-keeping that stretched across centuries, temple institutions where apprentice priests inherited not just the tablets, but the responsibility of continuing the watch. But this raises an intriguing possibility. If they were tracking Saturn's 29-year orbit with precision, and if they had access to older observations going back centuries, might they have also noticed slower movements? Dimmer wanderers whose orbits were so long that only compiled records across many lifetimes would reveal their pattern. Could they have detected Uranus's 84-year orbit, or Neptune's 164-year journey around the Sun through accumulated observations that no single astronomer would live to complete? The challenge of long-term astronomical observation in the ancient world cannot be overstated. Modern astronomers have computer databases storing centuries of observations, accessible instantly, easily analysed for patterns spanning decades or longer. Ancient astronomers had clay tablets, hundreds or thousands of them, stored in temple libraries, requiring physical retrieval and manual comparison to spot patterns. The organisational challenge alone is immense. How do you maintain a systematic observational program across multiple generations? The answer lies in institutional continuity. Temples in Mesopotamia weren't just religious sites. They were economic centres controlling vast agricultural lands, employing scribes and craftsmen, maintaining schools for training specialists. The great temples of Babylon, Uruk and Nippur had libraries and scriptoria where astronomical texts were copied, studied and preserved. Young apprentices were trained in astronomical observation and calculation, learning not just current techniques but the accumulated knowledge of previous generations. This created chains of transmission, masters teaching students who would themselves become masters, an unbroken lineage of astronomical knowledge spanning centuries. We know such continuity existed because the astronomical diaries, those daily records of celestial observations, span 7 centuries with consistent methodology and terminology. The observers of the 1st century BCE were using the same techniques, recording in the same format as their predecessors from 700 years earlier. This level of institutional stability is remarkable. It survived the rise and fall of empires, foreign conquests, political upheavals, economic disruptions. Through all of it, the observation program continued, the tablets were stored, the knowledge was transmitted. With such continuity, observations separated by centuries could be compared and analysed. An astronomer in 500 BCE could consult tablets recording observations from 1000 BCE, comparing planetary positions across a 500-year span. This makes it possible to detect long-term patterns invisible to any single lifetime of observation. Saturn's 29-year orbit could be mapped across multiple complete cycles, confirming periodicities, refining mathematical models, detecting subtle variations. But if you have records spanning centuries, you might notice other patterns. Imagine an astronomer comparing stellar positions from old tablets with current observations. They know about precession even if they don't understand its cause, because they can see that star positions have shifted over the centuries. Now imagine they notice a very faint star that appears in old observations but is in a slightly different position in current observations, moving against the background of fixed stars but so slowly that only comparison of observations separated by decades or centuries would reveal the motion. Uranus takes 84 years to orbit the Sun. An observer with access to observations spanning 2 centuries could potentially detect its movement through the zodiac, recognizing that this dim, star-like object wasn't fixed, but wandering at a pace far slower than Saturn. Neptune's 164-year orbit would be even more challenging, requiring comparison of observations across multiple centuries. But institutions that maintained records for 700 years had the data necessary to detect such slow movements if they were carefully analysing their accumulated observations. This is speculation, certainly. There's no clear evidence that Babylonian astronomers detected Uranus or Neptune. But the question isn't whether they had the theoretical framework to understand what they were seeing. They didn't need to know about heliocentrism or gravitational mechanics. They just needed to recognize that a faint object was moving against the background stars, slowly enough that only long-term accumulated records would reveal its wandering nature. And if any ancient civilization had the observational continuity and analytical sophistication to detect such movement, it was the astronomers of Babylon with their centuries of systematic skywatching and their vast archives of preserved observations. From the 8th century BCE to the 1st century CE, Babylonian astronomers maintained astronomical diaries, daily records of planetary positions, lunar phases, weather, and notable events. These tablets, thousands of them, represent the longest continuous scientific observation program in human history. 7 centuries of watching the sky, noting where Venus rose when Jupiter reached opposition, how Mars moved into retrograde. The dedication is staggering, but what's preserved is only a fraction of what once existed. Most tablets are lost, destroyed, or still buried. We have glimpses, fragments, enough to reconstruct their methodology but not the full extent of their knowledge. Among the surviving diaries are references to systematic observation programs, to standard procedures for tracking planetary movements, to mathematical models refined over generations. And occasionally there are tantalizing mentions of unusual celestial phenomena, movements that don't correspond to known planets, observations catalogued but not explained. Were they comets, asteroids? Or might some record the slow drift of outer planets, whose movements were so gradual that only the accumulated diaries of centuries would reveal their nature? The astronomical diaries are unlike any other ancient scientific records. They're not theoretical texts or teaching documents. They're working records, daily logs maintained by observers who noted celestial positions, weather conditions, river levels, market prices, political events. Each diary covers approximately 6 months, with observations recorded in a standardized format that remain consistent across the 7 centuries of the program's operation. The format is terse, economical, conveying maximum information in minimum space. Night of the 1st, the moon was 2 cubits behind the rear foot of the lion. Jupiter was in the crab, Mars, Saturn not visible. Thousands of these tablets survived, scattered across museum collections worldwide. But archaeologists estimate that what's preserved represents perhaps 5 to 10% of what once existed. The complete archive would have contained tens of thousands of tablets, an overwhelming mass of observational data covering 700 years of nightly skywatching. The lost tablets were destroyed when buildings collapsed, when Babylon was abandoned and the elements weathered exposed clay, when later occupants used ancient tablets as building material, or simply discarded them as meaningless artifacts of a dead civilization. What's remarkable is that the program maintained consistent methodology for 7 centuries, despite political upheavals that would seem to make continuity impossible. The diaries begin during the Neo-Assyrian Empire, continue through the Neo-Babylonian period, persist through Persian conquest, survive Alexander the Great's arrival, carry on through Seleucid rule, and finally cease only when Babylon itself was abandoned in the early centuries CE. Through all these regime changes, foreign occupations and cultural transformations, the observers maintain their program, using the same terminology, following the same procedures, preserving the tradition. This continuity wasn't maintained by individuals, it was institutional, embedded in temple structures that survived political changes. The astronomical observers weren't personally loyal to particular kings. They were priests and scribes dedicated to traditions that transcended politics, preserving knowledge systems they understood as having value, independent of whoever currently ruled. This attitude, that astronomical knowledge was worth preserving regardless of political circumstances, allowed the observation program to survive when everything else in Mesopotamian society was being transformed by conquest and cultural change. The surviving diaries contain systematic records of the 5 known planets, tracking their movements through the zodiac, noting retrograde motions, recording conjunctions and oppositions. The precision is sufficient that modern astronomers can calculate backward and determine exactly which planetary configurations the ancient observers were recording, verifying dates and confirming the accuracy of observations made over 2,000 years ago. But among these systematic records are occasional mentions of unusual phenomena, objects seen moving but not identified with known planets, descriptions that don't quite fit any expected celestial events, references to observations that required investigation or special attention. Most of these unusual observations have mundane explanations. Bright comets certainly, which were carefully distinguished from planets but still recorded. Meteors and meteor showers noted as interesting phenomena. Possible novae, stars that suddenly brightened and then faded. The ancient observers were cataloguing everything unusual they saw, not just the predictable movements of known planets. But occasionally among these reports are descriptions that make modern researchers pause. References to faint objects tracked over extended periods, movements too slow to be comets, trajectories too regular to be meteors. Without more context, without the complete diaries showing before and after observations, it's impossible to determine what these mysterious observations recorded. What we know is that the Babylonian astronomers had the data necessary to detect slow-moving outer planets if they systematically analysed their accumulated observations. 7 centuries of records, thousands of tablets, millions of individual observations of stellar and planetary positions. If Uranus or Neptune were recorded, even inadvertently as unusually positioned faint stars whose locations were noted over decades or centuries, the pattern would exist in the data. But most of that data is lost, and what survives is fragmentary, making it impossible to conclusively determine whether patterns we might recognize with modern analysis were ever detected by ancient astronomers working with the same data in different form. In 1901, divers recovering artifacts from a Roman shipwreck near the Greek island of Antikythera discovered a corroded bronze object that would rewrite our understanding of ancient technology. The Antikythera mechanism, dated to around 100 BCE, is an astronomical calculator of breathtaking complexity. It uses dozens of precisely cut gears to model the movements of the sun, moon, and planets, predicting eclipses and tracking celestial cycles. When X-ray analysis finally revealed its complete internal structure in the early 2000s, researchers realized it was more sophisticated than any known device for the next 1,000 years. The mechanism proves that ancient Mediterranean cultures had access to advanced astronomical knowledge and the engineering skill to mechanize it. But the mechanism raises questions about what came before it. Such sophistication doesn't appear from nothing. It suggests a tradition of astronomical modelling, of mathematical astronomy, of mechanical knowledge that must have developed over centuries. And much of that tradition would have drawn from Babylonian astronomy, from the same culture that produced those mysterious planetary lists that sometimes seem to count too many wanderers. The mechanism was found as a corroded mass of bronze, barely recognizable as an artifact rather than mineral formations. It spent decades in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, recognized as significant but not fully understood, until modern imaging technology could peer inside the corroded layers and reveal the intricate gearwork hidden within. What emerged from that analysis was astonishing. A device with at least 30 bronze gears, carefully designed with mathematically calculated tooth counts, assembled into a complex mechanism that could model multiple astronomical cycles simultaneously. The front dial shows the Greek zodiac and Egyptian calendar, allowing users to set a date and then calculate astronomical positions for that date. Gears inside the device model the movements of the sun and moon through the zodiac with remarkable accuracy, accounting for the moon's variable speed through its elliptical orbit using mechanical means that wouldn't appear again in European clockwork until the 14th century. Additional dials on the back of the device predict solar and lunar eclipses using the Saros cycle, that 18-year period discovered by Babylonian astronomers. Other mechanisms track the 4-year cycle of Greek athletic games, and possibly the movements of the 5 known planets, though the planetary display is damaged and its exact function remains debated. The sophistication lies not just in what the mechanism does, but in how it does it. The gear teeth are precisely cut, spaced with mathematical accuracy necessary for the device to function correctly over extended periods. The designers understood the astronomical cycles they were modelling well enough to translate them into mechanical ratios. They knew that the moon's synodic period, the time between successive full moons, is approximately 29.5 days, and they created gear ratios that modelled this with impressive accuracy. They incorporated the Metonic cycle, the 19-year period after which lunar phases return to the same dates, using this to create a long-term calendar function. This level of astronomical knowledge didn't originate in Greece alone. The eclipse predictions using the Saros cycle are directly derived from Babylonian astronomy. The mathematical models of planetary movements reflect techniques developed in Mesopotamia over centuries of observation and refinement. The mechanism represents a fusion of Greek mechanical engineering with Babylonian mathematical astronomy, creating a device that mechanizes knowledge accumulated over a millennium of systematic skywatching. But the Antikythera mechanism is from 100 BCE. The sophisticated astronomy it embodies is much older, tracing back through Greek adoption of Babylonian techniques to the original observers who spent centuries compiling the data and developing the mathematical models. The mechanism is an endpoint, a culmination of a long tradition, which means somewhere in the centuries before 100 BCE, there must have been earlier versions, simpler mechanical calculators, teaching devices, working models that astronomers used to visualize and predict celestial motions. None of these earlier devices have survived. Bronze corrodes, wood decays, mechanical devices are valuable enough that when they break, they're melted down and reused rather than discarded where archaeologists might find them centuries later. The Antikythera mechanism survived only because it was lost in a shipwreck, sealed in marine sediments that preserved the bronze even as it corroded. How many similar devices existed in ancient Mediterranean cities, used by astronomers and astrologers, teaching tools in philosophical schools? Demonstration pieces in temples? We have no idea because they're all gone, leaving only the one example that happened to survive under exceptional circumstances. This should make us cautious about declaring what ancient peoples couldn't have known or couldn't have done. The Antikythera mechanism exists. It's real. It's been analysed extensively. Its sophistication is undeniable. Before its discovery, historians would have confidently stated that such complex geared mechanisms didn't exist until medieval times. Now we know that ancient peoples were capable of mechanical sophistication we had no idea they possessed. What else might they have been capable of that left no surviving evidence? What other knowledge might they have had that we've dismissed as impossible, simply because we haven't found unambiguous proof in the fragmentary record that survives? On the ceiling of the Temple of Hathor. At Dendera in Egypt, carved in low relief and painted in colours that have faded but not disappeared, is one of the most complete ancient star maps ever found. The Dendera zodiac, created around 50 BCE, shows constellations, planets, and the precession of the equinoxes in a circular cosmological diagram that suggests sophisticated astronomical knowledge. But what's particularly relevant to our investigation is that Egyptian astronomy, by this late period, had absorbed centuries of Mesopotamian knowledge. The Babylonians were the masters of mathematical astronomy, and their observations, their techniques, their star catalogues had spread throughout the ancient Mediterranean world. When we look at the Dendera ceiling, we're seeing Egyptian interpretations of knowledge that originated in the ziggurats of Babylon and Ur, which means any mystery in Sumerian astronomy, any anomaly in their planetary counts, might echo through other ancient cultures' astronomical traditions. The cross-pollination of astronomical knowledge in the ancient world was extensive, which makes it all the more significant when multiple cultures seem to preserve hints of the same anomalous information. The Temple of Hathor at Dendera stands about 60 kilometers north of Luxor, a relatively late construction by Egyptian standards, built during the Ptolemaic period when Greek pharaohs ruled Egypt. The temple complex is remarkably well preserved, its colours still visible in places protected from direct sunlight, hieroglyphs and relief carvings maintaining their clarity across 2 millennia. But it's the ceiling of one particular chamber, the Chapel of Osiris, that holds the astronomical treasure. The zodiac is circular, unusual for Egyptian art which typically favoured rectangular formats. It shows the 12 constellations of the zodiac in a ring, with Egyptian deities and symbols integrated into the familiar stellar patterns. The Babylonian influence is unmistakable. The zodiacal constellations themselves, that band of 12 through which the sun and planets move, are a Mesopotamian concept adopted throughout the ancient world. Egypt had its own stellar traditions, its own ways of organising the sky into meaningful patterns, but by the Ptolemaic period Egyptian astronomy had become thoroughly internationalised, incorporating knowledge from across the Mediterranean and Near East. The planets are represented on the zodiac, though their exact identification is debated by scholars. Small figures that might represent planetary deities, positioned in specific constellations, perhaps recording an actual astronomical configuration from when the zodiac was designed. Some researchers have tried to use these positions to date the zodiac more precisely, calculating when the planets would have been in those positions, but the results are ambiguous, complicated by the symbolic nature of the representation and uncertainty about which figures represent which planets. What's significant is that Egyptian astronomers of this period had access to Babylonian astronomical texts. Alexandria, just a few hundred kilometers from Dendera, was the intellectual capital of the Hellenistic world, home to the great library where texts from across the known world were collected, translated, studied. Babylonian astronomical tablets were brought to Alexandria, their cuneiform script transliterated into Greek, their mathematical methods studied and adapted. Greek astronomers like Hipparchus and Ptolemy built their work directly on Babylonian foundations, using Babylonian observations and mathematical techniques to create their own astronomical models. This means that any knowledge preserved in Babylonian texts, any observations recorded on cuneiform tablets, had the potential to spread throughout the Mediterranean world. If Babylonian astronomers had detected something unusual, some anomaly in planetary counts or celestial movements, that knowledge could have been transmitted westward, preserved in Greek astronomical texts, represented in Egyptian temple ceilings. The Dendera zodiac is one data point in a network of astronomical knowledge that stretched from Babylon to Alexandria to Rome. The challenge is that by the time knowledge was transmitted through multiple cultures and languages, it often became distorted or simplified. Details that were clear in the original Babylonian context might become confused when translated into Greek, then adapted into Egyptian artistic representation. A technical astronomical term in Akkadian might lose its precision when rendered in Greek philosophical language. An observational detail preserved on a cuneiform tablet might be reinterpreted as mythology when carved into temple stone, but traces remain. Patterns persist across cultures. When multiple ancient civilizations preserve similar anomalies, similar numerical patterns, similar references to celestial bodies that don't quite fit expected categories, it suggests those anomalies might have a common origin. Perhaps in observations made in Babylon or Ur, recorded on tablets, transmitted through the ancient world's networks of knowledge exchange, preserved in fragmentary form in temples and manuscripts across the Mediterranean. The Dendera zodiac is one piece of a larger puzzle, one expression of astronomical knowledge whose full extent we can only guess at from the fragments that survived. The Earth's axis wobbles like a spinning top slowing down, completing one full cycle every 26,000 years. This wobble, called precession, causes the position of stars to shift slowly over centuries. The constellation that rises at the spring equinox changes over time, moving backward through the zodiac at a rate of about 1 degree every 72 years. This is such a slow change that detecting it requires comparing observations separated by centuries. The Greek astronomer Hipparchus is credited with discovering precession around 130 BCE, but there's evidence that earlier cultures knew about it too. The precision of stellar positions in Babylonian tablets, the way certain temples align with stars that would have been in different positions when the temples were built, suggests awareness of precession long before Hipparchus, and if ancient astronomers were capable of tracking changes that took centuries to become apparent, if they had access to observational records spanning millennia, what else might they have detected in the slow movements of the heavens? Hipparchus discovered precession by comparing stellar positions recorded in older Greek texts with his own observations. He noticed that stars had shifted position relative to the equinoxes, that the point where the sun crossed the celestial equator at spring was moving backward through the constellations. He calculated the rate of this movement and recognized it as a slow, continuous process rather than a sudden shift. This was theoretical astronomy at its finest, using accumulated observations separated by time to detect phenomena invisible to any single generation of observers. But Hipparchus had access to Babylonian observations. He explicitly references using Babylonian eclipse records in his work, comparing observations from centuries earlier with his own measurements. The Babylonians had been systematically recording stellar and planetary positions for far longer than the Greeks, maintaining observational programs that stretched back centuries before Hipparchus's lifetime. If Hipparchus could detect precession by comparing observations separated by a few centuries, the Babylonians, with their longer observational baseline, could have detected it earlier. There's indirect evidence they did. The precision with which Babylonian tablets record stellar positions, noting not just which stars are visible, but their exact positions relative to the horizon and to each other, suggests they were aware that stellar positions weren't static. Temple alignments that no longer correspond to the stars they were supposedly built to observe also hinted awareness of precession. If a temple was built to align with a particular star's rising point, and that star is now in a different position due to precession, it suggests the builders understood that stellar positions change over time. The challenge is that we don't have explicit Babylonian texts saying, quote 23, "We have observations accurate enough to reveal precession if analysed correctly, temple alignments that only make sense if precession was understood, mathematical models that might incorporate precessional movements without explicitly naming them. The evidence is circumstantial but compelling, and if they knew about precession, it demonstrates something profound about ancient astronomical capabilities. Detecting precession requires comparing observations separated by not just decades, but centuries. It requires maintaining accurate records across multiple generations, preserving observational data in forms that allow precise comparison, recognizing subtle patterns in accumulated measurements. This is exactly the kind of long-term, systematic, institutionally supported observation that could also detect other slow celestial movements. Uranus takes 84 years to complete one orbit. A single observer couldn't track its full circuit. But an institution maintaining precise records for centuries could compare observations separated by a human lifetime and detect that a particular faint star wasn't fixed but had moved position. Neptune's 164-year orbit would require even longer observational baselines, but Babylonian astronomy maintained systematic records for 7 centuries. If they were comparing stellar positions across centuries to detect precession, they had the data and methodology to potentially detect outer planets' slow movements through the zodiac. The same institutional dedication, the same multi-generational record-keeping, the same careful analysis of accumulated observations that allowed detection of precession could have revealed other slow celestial motions. Whether it did is uncertain, but the capability existed. The question isn't whether ancient astronomers could theoretically have detected slow-moving outer planets. The question is whether they actually did, and whether any record of such detection survives in the fragmentary texts that remain. Every 18 years, 11 days and 8 hours, the Sun, Earth and Moon return to approximately the same geometric relationship. This means that eclipses repeat in predictable patterns. The Babylonians discovered this, the Saros cycle, through careful observation and mathematical analysis. They could predict lunar eclipses with remarkable accuracy, and their predictions are recorded on tablets that modern astronomers can verify. The sophistication of this discovery can't be overstated. It requires not just watching eclipses when they happen, but recognizing the pattern across decades, building mathematical models to predict future occurrences. This is theoretical astronomy, not just observational. It's the moment when ancient science moved from recording what happened to predicting what would happen, using mathematical principles to model celestial mechanics. And if they could do this for eclipses, mapping complex three-body interactions over an 18-year cycle, what other long-term patterns might they have detected? What other celestial periodicities might have been recorded in tablets we haven't yet properly understood, or that are still buried beneath Mesopotamian tells? Eclipses are among the most dramatic celestial events, moments when the natural order seems suspended, when the sun or moon disappears in the middle of the day or night. Ancient peoples feared them, interpreted them as omens, built elaborate mythologies around them. But fear and mythology didn't prevent careful observation. Babylonian astronomers recorded eclipses systematically, noting dates, times, magnitudes, positions of the moon relative to stars, whether the eclipse was total or partial, how long it lasted. The Saros cycle's discovery required recognizing that eclipses separated by approximately 18 years were related, that they shared similar characteristics and occurred under similar celestial conditions. This pattern isn't obvious. Eclipses don't happen every 18 years. They happen irregularly from the perspective of any single location, sometimes several in a year, sometimes none for years. But when you compile records across decades, comparing all observed eclipses, a pattern emerges. Eclipses can be grouped into series, with each eclipse in a series separated by one Saros cycle from the previous. The mathematics underlying the Saros cycle involve the moon's orbital period, the sun's apparent motion through the ecliptic, and the moon's nodes, the points where the moon's orbit crosses the ecliptic plane. These three cycles have periods that happen to align almost perfectly every 18 years and 11 days, bringing the sun, moon and earth back into approximately the same configuration. The Babylonians didn't understand the geometry in modern terms. They didn't have heliocentric models or calculations of orbital mechanics, but they recognized the numerical pattern, developed mathematical schemes to predict when eclipses in a particular series would occur, and verified their predictions through continued observation. The accuracy of their eclipse predictions is verifiable. Modern astronomers can calculate backward, determining exactly when eclipses occurred in the ancient past. Confirming that Babylonian predictions recorded on tablets correspond to real astronomical events. The tablets sometimes predict eclipses that wouldn't have been visible from Babylon, suggesting their mathematical models could calculate eclipses for any location, not just eclipses they could directly observe. This is remarkably sophisticated theoretical work, but the discovery of the Saros cycle also demonstrates the analytical power of accumulated observations. The pattern only becomes apparent when you have records spanning multiple cycles, when you can compare eclipses separated by decades, when you have enough data to recognize periodicities hidden in apparently irregular phenomena. This same analytical approach, this recognition that patterns emerge from long-term accumulated data, could be applied to other celestial phenomena. Planetary positions recorded over centuries might reveal subtle patterns, long-term cycles, relationships between movements that aren't obvious from short-term observation. If Babylonian astronomers were analysing eclipse data with sufficient sophistication to discover the Saros cycle, they were certainly capable of analysing planetary data with similar rigour. What patterns might emerge from systematic analysis of 7 centuries of planetary observations? What long-term periodicities might be hidden in the accumulated data, visible only to astronomers with the mathematical tools and observational records to detect them? The tablets that survive show sophisticated mathematical astronomy, applied to the 5 known planets, developing schemes to predict positions, modelling variable speeds, accounting for retrograde motions. But these are the texts that survived, the topics that received enough attention to be copied and preserved. What other analyses might have been performed on data that exist only in the lost diaries, the tablets destroyed or still buried? The Saros cycle proves ancient astronomers could discover complex patterns through mathematical analysis of accumulated observations. Whether they discovered other patterns, other cycles, other celestial phenomena through similar analysis remains an open question that the fragmentary surviving record can't definitively answer. When we think of ancient astronomy, we imagine naked eye observation, priests standing on ziggurat terraces watching the horizon. But the ancient world had instruments. The astrolabe, though it reached its most sophisticated form in medieval Islam, has roots in Greek and possibly Babylonian astronomy. These devices allowed precise measurement of stellar positions, calculation of time and latitude, prediction of celestial events. The question that haunts the study of ancient astronomy is, what other instruments existed that haven't survived? Bronze and wood decay. Delicate mechanisms are lost to time. We have fragments, tantalizing hints in texts that describe measuring devices whose exact nature we can't reconstruct. Is it possible that ancient astronomers had optical aids we haven't discovered? Simple lenses were known in antiquity. The Nimrud lens, found in Assyria and dated to 700 BCE, is a piece of rock crystal ground to focus light. Could ancient astronomers have used such lenses to enhance their vision of the night sky, perhaps not powerful enough to see Uranus clearly, but enough to detect it as a faint star-like object whose movement marked it as a planet? The earliest known description of an astrolabe comes from Greek sources, but the astronomical knowledge it embodies is Babylonian. The device consists of a disk marked with celestial coordinates, a rotating overlay showing the positions of bright stars, and a sighting mechanism for measuring angles. With an astrolabe, you can determine the time at night by measuring stellar positions. Calculate your latitude from the altitude of the North Star. Predict when stars will rise or set. Solve various astronomical problems through geometric manipulation of the device's components. Such instruments weren't just theoretical. They were practical tools used by astronomers, astrologers, navigators, surveyors. The sophistication of the Antikythera mechanism proves that ancient peoples were capable of creating complex astronomical devices far more advanced than simple measuring tools. But instruments don't survive well. Metal is valuable and gets melted down for reuse. Wood rots. Delicate mechanisms break and are discarded. The Antikythera mechanism only survived because it sank in a shipwreck and was sealed in marine sediments. How many other astronomical instruments existed in ancient Babylon, Alexandria, Athens that are now completely lost? Texts mention measuring devices without describing them in enough detail for modern scholars to reconstruct their design. References to tools for measuring stellar altitudes, for determining planetary positions, for calculating time from solar or stellar observations. Some of these might be simple sighting tubes or graduated measuring rods. Others might have been more complex, incorporating moving parts or computational scales. We simply don't know, because the instruments are gone and the descriptions are too vague. The Nimrud lens raises particularly intriguing possibilities. It's a piece of rock crystal, carefully ground into a convex shape, clearly artificial rather than natural. Modern tests show it can focus light and magnify images, though not with the quality of modern optical glass. It was found in a palace context, dated to the 8th or 7th century BCE. Its purpose is debated. Some suggest it was used to start fires by focusing sunlight. Others propose it was a decorative item or jewellery component. But the most intriguing possibility is that it was an optical aid, a magnifying lens used to read fine text or examine small objects. If the Assyrians were grinding lenses in the 8th century BCE, could such lenses have been used for astronomical observation? A simple magnifying lens wouldn't create anything like a telescope. The optics are wrong, the design inadequate. But even a crude lens held to the eye might make faint stars slightly more visible, might allow detection of objects just below the threshold of naked eye visibility. Uranus at magnitude 6 is right at that threshold. Under perfect conditions, a person with excellent eyesight might barely detect it. With even a crude optical aid, something that gathered slightly more light than the naked pupil, detection might become more feasible. This is speculation, admittedly. There's no evidence that ancient astronomers used lenses for sky watching, but the Nimrud lens exists. Lens grinding technology was available in the ancient Near East. And if ancient peoples were capable of creating the Antikythera mechanism, of predicting eclipses with the Saros cycle, of maintaining systematic observation programs spanning 7 centuries, it's not unreasonable to wonder whether they might have experimented with optical aids to enhance their astronomical observations. The absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Particularly when dealing with materials and devices that decay or get recycled rather than surviving as archaeological artifacts. Among all the celestial bodies the Babylonians tracked, Venus receives special attention. The Venus tablet of Ammisaduqa is just one of many texts dedicated to this planet's movements. The precision with which they recorded Venus's appearances and disappearances, its positions relative to stars and other planets, its synodic period of 584 days suggests an almost obsessive focus. Why? Some scholars argue it was religious significance, Venus's identification with Inanna, goddess of love and war. Others suggest it was Venus's visibility and brightness, making it the easiest planet to track accurately. But there's another possibility. Venus was a test case. By perfecting their observations and mathematical models of Venus, Babylonian astronomers developed techniques they could then apply to other, dimmer, more difficult planets. The question is, how far did they extend these techniques? Did they turn their refined observational methods and mathematical astronomy toward the edge of visibility? Searching for dimmer wanderers whose movements would only be detectable with the most sophisticated approaches. Venus dominates the twilight sky in a way no other planet does. When visible, it's unmistakable, bright enough to be seen even in partial daylight if you know where to look, casting faint shadows on moonless nights. The Babylonians tracked Venus with devotion that goes beyond practical necessity. They didn't just note when it appeared in the morning or evening sky. They recorded its position relative to specific stars, its altitude above the horizon, how many days separated its disappearances and reappearances, how its brightness varied through its cycle. The Venus tablet of Ammisaduqa, which we discussed earlier, is just the most famous of many Venus texts. There are tablets dedicated entirely to Venus omens, to mathematical schemes for predicting its movements, to detailed observations of its appearances over extended periods. The attention given to Venus exceeds what was given to any other planet, even Jupiter, which was associated with Marduk, the supreme god of Babylon. Why this obsessive focus on Venus? The religious explanation is obvious. Inanna, later called Ishtar, was among the most important Mesopotamian deities. Her dual nature as goddess of both love and war made her complex and powerful, a deity who couldn't be ignored. Her identification with Venus, the brightest of planets, was natural and reinforced through mythology. The planet's disappearances and reappearances, its alternation between morning and evening star, mirrored Inanna's mythological journeys between the upper world and the underworld, so tracking Venus was an act of religious devotion as much as astronomical observation. But there's a more practical explanation. Venus is the easiest planet to track accurately because it's so bright, and its cycle is so regular. It appears in the evening sky, grows brighter over weeks, disappears as it passes between Earth and Sun, reappears in the morning sky, grows bright again, then disappears behind the Sun to begin the cycle anew. The entire cycle takes 584 days, almost exactly 8 Earth years for 5 Venus cycles, creating a pattern so regular it borders on perfection. This regularity makes Venus ideal for developing and refining observational and mathematical techniques. Imagine you're an ancient astronomer trying to develop systematic methods for tracking planets. You need to establish procedures for recording positions, for measuring angles, for calculating periodicities. Venus is your ideal subject. It's bright enough to see clearly even in less than perfect conditions. Its movements are dramatic enough to track easily, but regular enough to model mathematically. Success with Venus builds confidence and expertise that can then be applied to more difficult targets. Mercury is challenging because it's always close to the horizon, visible only in twilight, requiring perfect atmospheric conditions and precise timing. Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn are easier than Mercury, but dimmer than Venus, their cycles longer and more complex. By mastering Venus first, Babylonian astronomers developed a methodological template: systematic observation recorded in standardized formats, recognition of periodic patterns, development of mathematical schemes to model and predict positions, verification through continued observation. This template, perfected with Venus, could then be applied to other planets. The question that emerges is whether this progression continued beyond the 5 known planets. Having developed sophisticated techniques with Venus, having extended those techniques to the other visible planets, did Babylonian astronomers then turn their attention to the edge of visibility? Did they systematically search for fainter objects, dimmer wanderers whose movements would only be detectable with the refined observational methods developed through centuries of planetary tracking? The texts don't explicitly tell us. But the progression of sophistication, the movement from simple observation to complex mathematical modelling, suggests a culture that was constantly pushing boundaries, constantly searching for more to discover in the night sky. They watched with such dedication. For too long, modern scholarship approached ancient astronomy with unconscious condescension. The assumption was that without telescopes, without modern mathematics, without the scientific method as formalized in the Enlightenment, ancient peoples must have had only crude understandings of the cosmos. But each new discovery, each properly translated tablet, each analyzed temple alignment has forced a revision of this view. Babylonian mathematical astronomy was not primitive. It was sophisticated, systematic, and in some ways more advanced than Greek astronomy that came later. The Babylonians developed numerical methods for predicting planetary positions that European astronomy wouldn't match until the Renaissance. They understood synodic periods, sidereal periods, the complex dance of celestial mechanics, all without the heliocentric model that we consider essential to modern astronomy. They did it through observation, record-keeping, pattern recognition, and mathematical modelling. Which raises the question, if we've consistently underestimated their capabilities in areas we can verify, might we also be underestimating what they observed and recorded in areas where the evidence is more fragmentary? The history of discovering ancient astronomical sophistication is a history of surprises. Each generation of scholars believes they've finally grasped the extent of ancient knowledge, only for new evidence to reveal capabilities previously thought impossible. When the first cuneiform astronomical tablets were translated in the late 19th century, scholars were impressed by the systematic observations, but assumed the mathematical aspects were rudimentary. Then deeper analysis revealed complex numerical schemes. Sophisticated algorithms for planetary prediction that worked without any understanding of why planets moved as they did, pure empirical mathematics derived from centuries of data. When researchers first analysed Babylonian eclipse predictions, they assumed these were rough approximations based on pattern recognition. But verification against modern calculations showed the predictions were remarkably accurate, demonstrating understanding of the Saros cycle and its applications that wouldn't be matched in European astronomy until many centuries later. The Babylonians could predict not just when eclipses would occur, but their magnitude, duration, and the circumstances under which they'd be visible from specific locations. The discovery that Babylonians used geometrical methods for calculating planetary positions was even more revolutionary. Dr. Mathieu Ossendriver's analysis of tablets from Babylon revealed that astronomers in 350 BCE were using concepts similar to calculus, calculating the position of Jupiter by analysing the area under a curve representing velocity against time. This is sophisticated mathematical astronomy that European scholars wouldn't develop until the 14th century CE. The tablets show that Babylonian astronomers understood they could model planetary motion geometrically, not just numerically, demonstrating theoretical sophistication that fundamentally challenges assumptions about what ancient science was capable of achieving. Each of these discoveries was initially met with skepticism. Scholars had to be convinced by overwhelming evidence that ancient peoples really were this sophisticated, that the translations were accurate, that modern understanding wasn't being projected onto ancient texts. But the evidence accumulated, independent verification confirmed the findings, and gradually the scholarly consensus shifted to acknowledge capabilities that previous generations had considered impossible. This pattern of underestimation and gradual recognition raises an important question. If we've been consistently surprised by ancient astronomical sophistication in areas where evidence is clear, what about areas where evidence is fragmentary? We know Babylonian astronomy was far more advanced than early scholars assumed. We know they developed mathematical techniques centuries or millennia before such techniques appeared elsewhere. We know their observational programs were systematic, multi-generational, and remarkably accurate. Given this track record of surprising capabilities, should we be quite so confident in declaring what they couldn't have observed or known? The scholarly caution is understandable and necessary. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and the evidence for ancient knowledge of outer planets doesn't meet that standard. But caution shouldn't become assumption. The absence of clear evidence in fragmentary surviving text isn't definitive proof of absence, especially when dealing with a civilization whose astronomical capabilities have consistently exceeded expectations once we properly understand their methods and achievements. The question isn't whether we should accept that Sumerians knew about Uranus and Neptune. The question is whether we should remain open to the possibility that ancient astronomical knowledge might hold more surprises, that anomalies in the texts might represent phenomena we haven't yet properly understood, rather than errors we can safely dismiss. When the Library of Alexandria burned, ancient estimates suggested hundreds of thousands of scrolls were lost. Among them would have been copies of Babylonian astronomical texts, compilations of observations, theoretical treatises we can now only guess at. The loss of ancient libraries, whether to fire, war, or simple decay, represents an incalculable gap in our understanding of what ancient cultures knew. In Babylon itself, in the great libraries of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, in the temple archives of Uruk and Sippar, there must have been astronomical texts that never survived to be excavated by modern archaeologists. We're working with fragments, partial tablets, copies of copies. The most sophisticated observations, the most advanced theoretical work, the accumulated knowledge of the greatest astronomical minds of the ancient world might be entirely lost. Which means when we say there's no evidence the Sumerians knew about outer planets, we're really saying there's no evidence surviving among the tiny fraction of texts that have been preserved, excavated, and properly translated. The absence of evidence, in this case, proves very little about what might have been known and recorded in documents now lost forever. The Library of Alexandria represented the accumulated knowledge of the ancient Mediterranean world, a collection built systematically by the Ptolemaic kings who ruled Egypt after Alexander's conquests. They sent agents throughout the known world to acquire texts, confiscated books from ships docking at Alexandria to make copies before returning the originals, invited scholars to work at the library and contribute their knowledge to its collections. By some ancient accounts, the library held 400,000 scrolls at its height, though this number might be exaggerated. Even a fraction of that would represent an astonishing repository of knowledge. Among those scrolls were certainly Babylonian astronomical texts. Alexandria was the intellectual capital of the Hellenistic world, the place where knowledge from different cultures was brought together, translated, synthesized. Greek astronomers like Hipparchus and Ptolemy worked directly with Babylonian observations, incorporating Mesopotamian data into their own astronomical models. For this work, they would have needed access to translated or transliterated Babylonian texts, copies of the original cuneiform tablets rendered into Greek. These translations would have existed in the Library of Alexandria, along with Greek commentaries on Babylonian methods, compilations of observations, theoretical treatises that synthesize Mesopotamian and Greek approaches to astronomy. When the library burned, whether in a single catastrophic fire or through gradual destruction, across multiple centuries, all this knowledge was lost. We can't know what specific texts were destroyed. We can't know what observations, what calculations, what theoretical insights went up in flames or crumbled into dust. But we know that the loss was catastrophic, that centuries of accumulated knowledge disappeared, leaving gaps in our understanding that can never be completely filled. And Alexandria wasn't the only library to burn. The Library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, one of the great libraries of the ancient world, was destroyed when Nineveh fell in 612 BCE. Thousands of tablets were lost in the destruction, though archaeologists have recovered tens of thousands more from the ruins. But what survived is a fraction of what existed. Many tablets were burned in fires that swept the city. Others were deliberately destroyed by conquerors. Still more have been lost to erosion and decay over 2.5 millennia. In Babylon itself, in Uruk, in Sippar and Nippur and the other great cities of Mesopotamia, temple libraries held astronomical archives that were destroyed or dispersed when the cities declined and were eventually abandoned. The cuneiform tradition died. The knowledge of how to read the ancient scripts was lost, and tablets that survived the initial destruction were often buried under meters of accumulated debris. Damaged by moisture and salt infiltration, broken by the weight of earth pressing down over centuries, what we have is what survived by chance. Tablets baked hard enough to resist decay, buried in conditions that happened to preserve clay, recovered by archaeologists who recognized their value and knew how to excavate them properly. This is a tiny, unrepresentative sample of what once existed. The most important texts might be entirely lost. The breakthrough observations, the theoretical innovations, the accumulated wisdom of the greatest astronomers, all might have been recorded on tablets that didn't survive or haven't yet been excavated. So when we say there's no evidence for ancient knowledge of outer planets, we need to acknowledge what that statement really means. It means that among the small fraction of texts that survived, that have been excavated, that have been properly translated and analysed, we haven't found clear evidence. It doesn't mean such evidence never existed. It means that if it existed, it's among the vast majority of ancient astronomical knowledge that's been lost forever to fire, decay, and the simple passage of time. In recent decades, a new generation of archaeoastronomers has begun revisiting Sumerian and Babylonian texts with fresh eyes and better analytical tools. Computer modelling of ancient celestial positions, statistical analysis of observational data, multispectral imaging of damaged tablets revealing text previously illegible. All these techniques are uncovering nuances in ancient astronomical records that earlier researchers missed. Dr. Mattia Ossendriver's work on Babylonian astronomy has revealed that they were using sophisticated geometrical methods to calculate Jupiter's position 1400 years before similar techniques appeared in European astronomy. Each discovery like this reinforces how much we still don't understand about ancient astronomical knowledge, and among contemporary researchers, there's a growing openness to the possibility that some anomalies in the texts might represent actual observations we haven't yet properly interpreted rather than errors, myths, or symbolic elaborations. The question of whether Sumerians had knowledge of outer planets remains controversial and largely dismissed. But the conversation has become more nuanced, more willing to sit with uncertainty, rather than rushing to conclusions based on assumptions about what ancient peoples could or couldn't have known. Modern technology has transformed the study of ancient texts. Multispectral imaging allows researchers to see writing on damaged tablets that's invisible to the naked eye. Different wavelengths of light can reveal traces of ink or impressions in clay that have faded over millennia. Computer analysis can compare tablets from different periods and locations, identifying patterns and connections that manual study might miss. Statistical methods can analyze large data sets of observations, detecting subtle patterns in how ancient astronomers recorded celestial phenomena. Dr. Ossendriver's discovery of geometrical methods in Babylonian astronomy came from careful analysis of tablets that had been known for decades but never fully understood. He recognized that what earlier scholars had interpreted as purely numerical calculations were actually geometric constructions, that the Babylonians were using area calculations to determine planetary positions. This required not just reading the texts, but understanding the mathematical concepts well enough to recognize them in unfamiliar form, to see that ancient astronomers were doing sophisticated theoretical work, even though they described it in terms completely different from how modern mathematicians would approach the same problems. This discovery has implications beyond just adding another item to the list of Babylonian achievements. It demonstrates that ancient astronomical texts can contain sophisticated concepts that aren't immediately apparent, that require modern analytical tools and deep mathematical understanding to recognize. If geometrical methods were hidden in plain sight on tablets scholars had studied for decades, what else might be waiting to be discovered in texts we think we already understand? Contemporary researchers are approaching ancient astronomy with more humility about assumptions and more openness to surprising findings. The field has learned from past underestimations. When scholars confidently declare that ancient peoples couldn't have known about precession, or couldn't have developed sophisticated mathematical astronomy without Greek influence, or couldn't have created mechanical computers like the Antikythera mechanism, they were proven wrong by evidence that eventually emerged. This history encourages a more cautious approach to declaring what ancient peoples couldn't have known or done. The question of outer planets remains contentious. The mainstream position is clear. There's no credible evidence that Sumerians or Babylonians knew about Uranus, Neptune, or any trans-Saturnian bodies. But within that consensus, there's growing acknowledgement of anomalies that don't have completely satisfying explanations. References in text that don't quite fit expected patterns. Numerical schemes that seem more complete than they should be. Descriptions that could be interpreted in multiple ways, some of which might suggest knowledge beyond the 5 visible planets. Most researchers still interpret these anomalies as errors, mythological elaborations, or technical terminology we're misunderstanding. But there's increasing willingness to say quote 24 rather than quote 25, to acknowledge that fragmentary evidence can support multiple interpretations, that absence of proof isn't proof of absence, that ancient astronomical knowledge might still hold surprises that future discoveries will reveal. The conversation has become more nuanced, more intellectually honest about the limits of what we can know from incomplete evidence. The astronomical tablets weren't found in isolation. They emerged from temple libraries alongside medical texts that describe surgical procedures, mathematical tablets that solve complex equations, engineering documents that detail irrigation systems and architectural projects. The Sumerians and Babylonians who tracked the stars were also performing cataract surgery, calculating compound interest, building ziggurats with precise alignments, smelting bronze, creating complex legal codes. Their civilization was not primitive, it was sophisticated across multiple domains of knowledge. When we see this context, the idea that their astronomy might have achieved observational feats we can't fully explain becomes less far-fetched. These were cultures that excelled at systematic observation, record-keeping, mathematical modelling, and the transmission of technical knowledge across generations. If any ancient people could have detected the subtle movements of dim outer planets through accumulated observations and mathematical analysis, it would have been the astronomer priests of Mesopotamia. The archaeological context of Mesopotamian astronomy reveals a civilization of impressive breadth and depth. Medical texts describe procedures that wouldn't be performed in Europe for centuries. Tablets explain how to remove cataracts from eyes, how to set broken bones, how to treat various ailments with herbal remedies, whose effectiveness modern pharmacology has sometimes confirmed. These weren't folk remedies passed down orally. They were systematic medical knowledge, recorded in detail, taught in schools, refined through practice and observation. Mathematical tablets show that Mesopotamian mathematicians could solve quadratic equations, calculate compound interest, determine the area of irregular shapes, work with fractions and proportions. They developed place-value notation using base 60, a system so effective that we still use it for measuring time and angles. They understood the Pythagorean theorem centuries before Pythagoras, using it for practical surveying and construction problems. Their mathematics wasn't just theoretical, it was applied to real-world problems in commerce, engineering, and astronomy. Engineering documents describe irrigation systems of remarkable sophistication, canals and dams and water-lifting devices that turned arid land productive, supporting dense populations in regions where agriculture should have been impossible. They built ziggurats, massive stepped pyramids that aligned with cardinal directions and celestial events. Structures that required sophisticated surveying, large-scale organization of labor, and engineering knowledge to ensure stability over centuries. The great ziggurat of which Leonard Woolley partially reconstructed, was a marvel of ancient engineering, its foundations designed to compensate for the settling of underlying soil, its drainage systems preventing water damage, its astronomical alignments accurate enough to support complex celestial observations. Metallurgical texts show they were smelting bronze, creating alloys with specific properties for different purposes, understanding through experiment and experience how to manipulate materials to achieve desired characteristics. Legal codes demonstrate sophisticated understanding of property rights, contracts, criminal justice, social organization. The Code of Hammurabi, with its detailed prescriptions for different situations, shows a civilization thinking systematically about justice and social order. This is the context in which Mesopotamian astronomy developed, not isolated sky-watching by primitive peoples, but systematic observation by a sophisticated civilization that excelled at accumulating knowledge, developing techniques, and preserving information across generations. When astronomers in this civilization recorded celestial observations, they were working within institutions that valued precision, that supported multi-generational programs, that had the resources and expertise to tackle complex problems. The sophistication in one domain suggests sophistication in others. A civilization capable of performing cataract surgery probably had excellent observational skills and steady hands. A culture that could calculate compound interest and solve quadratic equations certainly had the mathematical tools necessary for sophisticated astronomical modelling. A society that built precisely aligned structures and managed complex irrigation Systems understood systematic observation and the importance of accurate measurements. When we consider whether such a civilization might have detected phenomena at the edge of observability, we should remember they were excellent at pushing boundaries in other domains. They were performing surgeries that required seeing and manipulating tiny structures in the eye. They were making astronomical predictions that required tracking subtle patterns in data accumulated over centuries. They were building structures that required measurements precise to fractions of degrees. If any ancient civilization had the combination of observational skill, mathematical sophistication, institutional continuity, and systematic methodology necessary to detect faint, slow-moving planets, it was Mesopotamia. After decades of excavation, after thousands of tablets translated and analysed, after countless doctoral theses and academic conferences devoted to Babylonian astronomy, certain questions remain unanswered. Why do some texts seem to reference more than 5 planets? What were the Sumerians tracking when they listed 7 celestial wanderers? How did they achieve precision in planetary observations that should have required instruments they supposedly didn't possess? Were their methods entirely observational, or did they have theoretical frameworks we haven't yet recognized in the texts? The scholarly consensus remains that there's no credible evidence for ancient knowledge of Uranus, Neptune, or other trans-Saturnian bodies, and yet the anomalies persist. References that don't quite fit, numbers that seem too complete, descriptions that suggest familiarity with celestial movements beyond the edge of normal visibility. Perhaps the answer is mundane, mistranslations and misunderstandings on our part, symbolic language we're reading too literally. Or perhaps buried in fragments of clay tablets still unexcavated beneath Iraqi tells, or damaged beyond legibility in museum basements, there are records of observations that would force us to revise everything we think we know about when humanity first mapped the full extent of our solar system. The tablets rest silent, patient as the stars they catalogue, waiting for someone to ask the right questions. The mystery of ancient astronomy isn't resolved. It's ongoing, an active area of research where new discoveries continue to surprise and challenge assumptions. Each year brings new translations, new analysis of old tablets using modern techniques, new archaeological excavations that might uncover texts that change our understanding. The field moves slowly, carefully, with appropriate skepticism about extraordinary claims. But it moves, and the direction has consistently been toward recognizing greater sophistication in ancient astronomy than previous generations acknowledged. The specific question of whether Sumerians or Babylonians knew about outer planets will likely never be definitively answered, unless some remarkably explicit text is discovered. The evidence is too fragmentary, too open to multiple interpretations, but the question serves a useful purpose. It reminds us that absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, especially when dealing with civilizations where most knowledge has been lost. It encourages humility about declaring what ancient peoples couldn't have known. It prompts researchers to look more carefully at anomalies rather than dismissing them as errors. What we know for certain is that Mesopotamian astronomy was sophisticated, systematic, and remarkably accurate. They tracked planets with precision that required multi-generational observation programs. They developed mathematical models that could predict celestial positions without understanding the physical mechanisms behind planetary motion. They maintained these programs for centuries, preserving knowledge through political upheavals and cultural changes. They were, by any measure, excellent astronomers working within the constraints of their technology and theoretical frameworks. What we don't know is the full extent of what they observed and recorded. Most of their texts are lost. What survives is fragmentary, often damaged. Sometimes ambiguous in meaning. Among the surviving texts are anomalies that professional scholars acknowledge even as they offer mundane explanations. References to 7 planets, when there should be 5. Technical terms whose exact meaning remains debated. observational precision that seems to require better instruments than we think they possessed. Perhaps these anomalies are simply what they appear to be in mainstream interpretation: errors, symbolic numbers, technical terminology we've misunderstood. Perhaps 7 planets means 5 planets plus sun and moon, despite linguistic evidence that sometimes seems to distinguish these categories. Perhaps the precision is exaggerated by our modern analysis, reading more accuracy into ancient observations than was actually there. Perhaps the references that don't fit are mythological elaborations or corruptions introduced through centuries of copying tablets. Or perhaps, somewhere in the vast quantity of knowledge that's been lost, there were observations and records that would reveal ancient astronomy pushed further than we currently believe. Perhaps systematic analysis of centuries of accumulated data revealed patterns we can't detect in the fragments that survive. Perhaps optical aids or observational techniques we haven't discovered enhanced their ability to see faint objects. Perhaps the anomalies in surviving texts are echoes of knowledge more complete in documents now lost. The tablets rest in museum cases, behind protective glass, in climate-controlled storage. Clay pressed with reed styluses 4,000 years ago, baked hard by ancient fires, preserved through chance and circumstance when so much else was lost. They hold what survived of Mesopotamian astronomy, a fraction of what once existed, enough to reveal sophistication and spark questions, but not enough to answer all the mysteries they contain. And beneath the tells of Iraq, under meters of accumulated debris from millennia of habitation, more tablets wait. Some will be excavated in coming decades, others may never be found, remaining buried until decay makes them unreadable, until the last physical traces of ancient knowledge return to dust. The mystery persists because the evidence is incomplete and interpretation is uncertain. But perhaps that's fitting. Perhaps some questions are meant to remain open, encouraging continued investigation, prompting new approaches to old problems, reminding us that the ancient world still has secrets waiting to be discovered by those patient and careful enough to look. And so the ancient sky continues to hold its secrets, patient and vast above us, the same stars the Sumerians watched from ziggurat terraces 4,000 years ago. The tablets rest silent in their cases, clay pressed with urgency by hands long turned to dust, warnings or wisdom or simple observations we may never fully understand. Perhaps that's as it should be. Perhaps some knowledge is meant to remain at the edge of certainty, neither proven nor disproven, existing in that liminal space where history blurs into mystery and the impossible brushes against the merely improbable. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, you're under the same celestial dome those ancient astronomers watched with such intensity. The planets still wander through the constellations, tracing paths that Babylonian mathematicians modelled with remarkable precision. Uranus moves through its 84-year orbit, invisible to your eyes but present nonetheless, circling the sun as it has for billions of years. Neptune drifts even further out, cold and distant. Its existence unknown to most of human history until that moment in 1846 when mathematics revealed what eyes couldn't see. But somewhere in the fragmentary clay records, in the anomalies scholars acknowledge without fully explaining, in the references that don't quite fit expected patterns, there might be echoes of observations we've forgotten how to interpret. Or there might be nothing but the human tendency to find mystery where there's only misunderstanding, to see impossible knowledge in ambiguous language, to prefer wonder over mundane explanation. Either way, the question itself is beautiful. The possibility that ancient peoples might have known more than we think, that knowledge might have been lost and could still be waiting in unexcavated tells or damaged tablets, keeps us humble about declaring certainty where evidence is incomplete. So let yourself drift now into the same darkness those ancient astronomers watched, beneath stars whose light has been travelling since before human civilization began. You're part of an unbroken chain of watchers, of wanderers, of people who looked up and asked what moved in the night beyond the edge of sight. The sky is patient. The stars are still there. The mysteries can wait while you rest, held by the same ancient darkness that holds us all. Sleep now. The cosmos will still be here, vast and beautiful and full of questions when you wake.